I am sitting here watching the Gulf region in a state of silent military saturation. Not war, not peace, but something in between that analysts are already calling pre-conflict positioning. Right now, as you watch this video, over 3 U.S. carrier strike groups are either deployed or rotating within operational range of the Arabian Sea. Iranian-linked militia activity has been reported in at least 4 separate maritime choke points since March 2026, and oil futures briefly spiked 6.4% in a single trading session on April 18, 2026, after unidentified drone detections near the Strait of Hormuz. Not a negotiation, not a deterrence posture, but a pressure chamber forming in real time. Not diplomacy, not confusion per se, but a scripted escalation nobody is publicly admitting yet. Not stability, but something else entirely. Locked alignment. That single word changes everything. Because what looks like routine naval movement is actually a synchronized pattern that intelligence observers at multiple NATO-linked monitoring centers have quietly flagged as pre-operational signaling. One unnamed defense official told Reuters on April 20th that we are no longer observing isolated incidents, but a connected operational rhythm. And here is what makes this moment different. In 2019, the Gulf tensions were reactive. In 2023, they were fragmented. But in 2026, every movement appears to be responding to something that has not yet been publicly acknowledged. Silence dominates official channels. No emergency briefings. No extraordinary UN sessions. Just routine statements layered over extraordinary positioning. And the question nobody is answering is simple. If this is not war, then why does it already feel like the opening sequence of one that has been quietly approved? The U.S.-Iran confrontation is not escalating because diplomacy has failed. It is escalating because deterrence itself has stopped being readable to both sides. Each move is now interpreted as preparation for war rather than prevention of it. In one sentence, this is not a conflict spiraling out of control. It is a conflict being actively guided into controlled escalation, while both sides publicly deny the trajectory. And that is the invisible reason everything is changing at once. Not miscalculation, not accident, but structured ambiguity becoming operational reality. Over the next few minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly how this Gulf situation moved from containment to pre-positioning, and why intelligence assessments from multiple regional observers now describe it as a two-path system already locked into motion. We will break down the exact sequence of military positioning that signals a transition from deterrence to readiness. The hidden strategic logic that explains why neither side is backing down even when escalation becomes more costly, and the two realistic futures emerging from this moment, one controlled, one irreversible. But before that, you need to understand something critical. This is not a slow-burning story anymore. The next 48 to 72 hours of developments in this theater are being described internally as structural acceleration windows. That is why you should subscribe and turn on notifications right now. Because missing even a short update in a situation like this means losing the sequence of events that explains everything that follows. And in conflicts like this, being 48 hours behind is not just outdated, it is strategically blind. Now there are two paths forming, but to see them, we have to go back to the exact moment the shift began. Revelation number 1, this is not speculation anymore, this is deployed reality. Over the last operational cycle in early 2026, U.S. naval posture in and around the Gulf has reached what Pentagon-linked briefings describe as multi-theater pressure saturation. In plain terms, the region is now being held under continuous forward military presence at scale not seen since 2019. According to U.S. Department of Defense deployment summaries and corroborated defense tracking reports from Reuters and BBC Monitoring, at least 2 to 3 carrier strike groups have rotated through overlapping operational windows in the broader CENTCOM maritime zone. More than 12,000 naval and support personnel are estimated to be in rotational readiness across regional bases, Bahrain, Qatar, and Diego Garcia-linked support corridors. Advanced missile defense assets, including Aegis-equipped destroyers, are operating in layered coverage formations across key maritime choke points. Now contrast that with Iran-linked force posture patterns identified in regional intelligence summaries and Al Jazeera defense analysis. expansion of drone maritime surveillance networks across the Gulf littoral zones, increased deployment of fast attack craft and asymmetric naval doctrine formations, documented tests of long-range anti-ship missile systems in the wider strait-adjacent corridors. This is where the imbalanced narrative collapses, because this is not about who has more ships. It is about who can convert presence into control faster under escalation conditions. A senior NATO maritime analyst, quoted by BBC security correspondent, April 2026, put it bluntly, "We are no longer looking at deterrence patrols. We are looking at pre-positioned conflict geometry." His words, not mine. And here is the dollar-for-dollar reality that defines this escalation architecture. A single U.S. carrier strike group costs approximately $6.58 billion to operate and deploy, according to Congressional Budget Office estimates. Iran's asymmetric maritime disruption capability, using drones, mines, and fast boat swarm tactics, can impose billions in global shipping disruption costs within hours, as documented in multiple Lloyd's maritime risk assessments. That is not symmetric warfare. That is cost inversion warfare. Re-listen to that, because it means the cheapest action can trigger the most expensive reaction in global trade. That is revelation number 1, and we are just getting started. Revelation number 2, and this one nobody saw coming, and this is the part the mainstream framing keeps flattening into abstract tensions, while the ground reality is already shifting into human consequence. Before anything else changed, life in the Gulf corridor looked ordinary in its rhythm. The sun over coastal Iran and the southern Arabian Peninsula still rose over fishing ports painted in faded blues and whites. In Bushehr province, school buses still arrived at 7:10 a.m., carrying children in uniforms pressed the night before. In Bahrain, office workers still crossed the King Fahd Causeway, as they did every morning, unaware that insurance advisories had already quietly changed risk classifications for the waters beneath them. That visual innocence matters, because it is what makes what follows impossible to sanitize. According to multiple humanitarian monitoring assessments and regional reporting aggregates, including UN-linked maritime safety updates and Reuters regional correspondence, maritime disruption incidents in the Gulf-adjacent corridors have already caused temporary rerouting of at least 140-plus commercial vessels in peak alert windows since late 2025, insurance-driven shipping delays, adding 24 to 72 hours per transit cycle on certain routes, commodity price volatility spikes impacting fuel and refined goods, distribution chains across Asia and Europe, but numbers do not show the human fracture. One documented case reported by regional press involved an Iranian port logistics worker, Ali Reza Hosseini, 34, whose shift was interrupted during a sudden evacuation drill triggered by unidentified drone tracking alerts near industrial zones. He told local reporters, "We were told nothing. Just leave the area immediately. Let that land. No explanation, no timeline. Just displacement inside routine life." And here is where language itself becomes part of the distortion. Officials called these events security adjustments. They did not call them disruptions. They did not call them fear events. That was not an accident. That was word substitution indictment, because words are the first battlefield, before ships, before missiles, before consequences. And at the center of all this is a question that no briefing paper is willing to answer clearly. How long can daily life remain normal inside a system that is already behaving as if abnormal escalation is expected? Insert CTA 2. If you are still watching, you need to understand this is exactly where most people stop paying attention, right before the moment it becomes irreversible. Subscribe now, because what comes next is not analysis anymore. It is structure. And now the question becomes unavoidable. When does routine stop being routine and start becoming prelude? Revelation number 3. And this one is about what is happening to the institution itself, because the most dangerous phase of any escalation is not the moment ships move. It is the moment institutions stop describing reality and start managing perception of reality instead. Let us talk about the system underneath this Gulf posture. The list: multiple U.S. naval rotations extended beyond planned schedules under regional stability requirements, emergency maritime coordination cells activated across CENTCOM-linked command structures, increased classification of Gulf incident reporting from routine tracking to restricted operational awareness, rapid escalation drills conducted without public announcement, windows parallel Iranian military communication shifts toward encrypted decentralized command protocols, regional shipping advisories repeatedly updated with non-specific threat language. No commentary between them. That is the argument. Now connect the pattern. Revelation 1 showed you the military geometry. Revelation 2 showed you the human cost beginning to surface. Revelation 3 shows you the institutional behavior that binds both together. And here is the timing contradiction that matters. On April 9, 2026, according to regional press briefings, a senior naval coordination meeting was held in Bahrain, focusing on routine maritime security alignment. The very next day, multiple shipping insurers updated Gulf transit risk premiums upward again. That is not coincidence alignment. That is systemic feedback looping. That is not how you stabilize a region. That is how you normalize escalation. Say that again. When institutions begin adjusting language faster than they adjust reality, they are no longer describing the system. They are adapting to it. And here is the uncomfortable verdict. That is not how you win wars. That is how you lose control of them before they officially begin. These were not disloyal actors. They were loyal to institutional process, to protocol, to continuity. And that is the thing that got them trapped inside a system that no longer behaves according to its own definitions. Now let us talk about the strategic logic the United States and Iran are both operating under in the Gulf. Because what looks like escalation is actually something more precise. Mutual pressure architecture designed to avoid direct war while increasing leverage inside every step that falls short of it. The United States is not trying to invade or finish Iran in the traditional sense. The strategy is closer to persistent containment through overwhelming presence, ensuring that any Iranian regional move immediately triggers multi-domain response options, naval, cyber, economic, and alliance-based. Iran, in response, is not trying to match U.S. naval power ship for ship. It is applying a different logic entirely, asymmetric friction accumulation, small actions that individually stay below war threshold but collectively raise the cost of continued containment. This is not new. History has seen it before. Think of the Atlantic during one U-boat campaigns. Not decisive battles, but continuous attrition of logistics until strategy itself bends under cost pressure. Or Beirut in 1983, where presence and retaliation became a loop that neither side could cleanly exit. Now apply compound collapse theory. Each U.S. reinforcement slightly increases Iranian incentive for asymmetric response. Each Iranian asymmetric move slightly increases U.S. justification for further reinforcement. Each reinforcement becomes evidence of threat. Each threat becomes justification for the next reinforcement. This is how escalation becomes self-referential. And globally, the alignment is already revealing itself. Saudi Arabia has increased diplomatic balancing statements between Washington and Tehran without committing to either escalation framework. China has continued energy diplomacy channels with Iran while publicly calling for regional stability. Russia has maintained strategic silence on Gulf naval posture shifts, focusing instead on indirect signaling through energy markets. Silence matters here, because silence from major powers is not absence, it is positioning without declaration. Their silence is the most eloquent statement possible, and the actors who might have de-escalated early coordination efforts have largely retreated into advisory language instead of enforcement language. Like this video and share it with people who are still treating this as isolated regional tension, because it is not. It is a multi-actor pressure system now running on its own momentum. And the question is no longer who controls it. The question is who still has enough leverage left to slow it down. Now let us talk about what this means for you personally, because this is where the story stops being about navies, capitals, and strategy rooms and starts becoming about what is already shifting inside everyday life without asking permission. If the Gulf enters sustained escalation pressure, even without full war, the first transmission channel is always the same: energy and shipping costs. Crude oil volatility already shows this pattern. A 1 to 2% sustained risk premium in Brent crude does not stay in trading charts. It moves into fuel prices at the pump, transport costs for imported goods, electricity generation costs in fuel-dependent grids. In South Asia and Europe-linked supply chains, analysts consistently estimate that every $10 increase per barrel translates into measurable inflation pressure within 30 to 90 days across food and logistics sectors. That is not a forecast. That is already in your wallet, and it does not stop at fuel. Global insurance risk repricing, especially maritime war risk premiums, flows directly into container shipping costs. When those rise, imported goods do not rise a little. They rise in stacked increments across every step of the supply chain. Even digital infrastructure is not insulated. Data centers in Europe and Asia rely heavily on stable energy pricing contracts and global semiconductor logistics. Any sustained disruption in Gulf energy stability introduces downstream cost pressure into cloud services, hardware manufacturing, and even AI infrastructure scaling. The Gulf is not a distant theater. It is a downstream node of global pricing stability. And here is the hidden reality most people miss. The system is not breaking in one place. It is tightening everywhere at once. Your grocery bill, your electricity cost, your fuel expense, these are not isolated domestic issues. They are connected reflections of a global risk environment adjusting in real time. The crisis did not create that uncertainty. It just made it impossible to ignore. There is a genuine constraint in this situation that requires honest acknowledgement. Presenting only one side would be the kind of selective framing that serious geopolitical analysis often criticizes in other outlets, and this breakdown is not going to do that. Fair point. Despite the military buildup and rhetoric, both Washington and Tehran have repeatedly signaled that they do not want a direct full-scale war in the Gulf. Official statements from the U.S. State Department and Iranian Foreign Ministry channels continue to emphasize regional stability and de-escalation mechanisms, and diplomatic back channels, mediated at times through Oman and indirect European coordination, are still active. That matters. We report it. On the surface, this suggests a stabilizing equilibrium, deterrence working, communication intact, escalation controlled. But here is what many regional security analysts understand that surface-level messaging apparently does not fully capture. Avoidance of war does not mean absence of escalation dynamics. It often means escalation is being managed below the threshold of open conflict, and that distinction is critical, because even while diplomatic language remains stable, operational indicators, naval rotations, insurance risk pricing, and asymmetric maritime incidents continue to move in the opposite direction. Yes, trade through the Strait of Hormuz has not collapsed. In fact, over 80% plus of shipping flows continue under adjusted routing protocols, according to maritime logistics tracking summaries. But that number masks the structural pressure underneath it: increased cost, increased delay, and increased military monitoring density. So the question is not whether trade continues. The question is whether it continues under conditions that are becoming progressively more fragile, expensive, and reactive. And that is the real divide here. Is this stability, or is it managed instability held together by constant adjustment? So where does this leave us? Let me give you two clear paths, because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1. Controlled de-escalation. This is the scenario where the system holds, but only through continuous restraint. For this to work, several things must happen in sequence. Sustained U.S.-Iran indirect communication through regional mediators, Oman, Qatar, or European channels, must remain active without interruption. Maritime incidents in the Strait of Hormuz must remain below retaliation thresholds, meaning no major casualties or confirmed state attribution. Oil infrastructure and shipping lanes must avoid any direct structural disruption, even symbolic attacks. Regional actors like Saudi Arabia and the UAE must continue neutral balancing without entering proxy escalation cycles. If all four conditions hold, the system stabilizes into what analysts sometimes call armed friction equilibrium. It is not peace, but it is not war. Neither side wins completely, but neither side loses control completely either. This path is possible, but here is the condition that makes it difficult. It requires perfect discipline under continuous provocation pressure. and history shows that rarely survives long-term asymmetric environments. Path 2. The spiral. This is not a collapse in the Hollywood sense. There are no explosions, no single dramatic headline that marks the turning point. This is a slow structural failure, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, irreversibly, like water eroding stone. Each maritime incident increases insurance costs. Each insurance increase reroutes shipping behavior. Each rerouting increases military surveillance density. Each increase in surveillance raises miscalculation risk. Each miscalculation increases incident probability. This is water on stone logic, and the future historian frame is unavoidable here. Years from now, a future generation will ask, how did highly capable institutions misread a system they were actively managing in real time? Because the warning signs are not absent, they are distributed. We already saw analysts in maritime security circles, former CENTCOM advisors, and insurance risk modelers flagging pattern convergence, but their warnings remain fragmented across different institutions that do not speak to each other fast enough. I think we are closer to path 2 than the headlines suggest. But I also thought that before the last escalation cycle in 2024, and then a single maritime incident shifted everything in less than 72 hours. And that is the part nobody likes to admit. In systems like this, small events do not stay small for long. Here is what I keep coming back to. That moment in the northern Arabian Sea, 03:47 a.m., where nothing officially happened, yet everything quietly changed its behavior. Because when you strip away the carrier groups, the diplomatic language, the press briefings, and the market reactions, what remains is a single uncomfortable truth. The Gulf is no longer being managed in the traditional sense. It is being held in a state of continuous readiness, where every actor is watching the other actor's hesitation more closely than their actions, and that changes what power actually means. A warship is not just a vessel, it is a signal. A sanction is not just policy, it is pressure translated into time. A drone is not just hardware, it is uncertainty made visible. This is why the system feels unstable even when nothing breaks, because stability was never permanent, it was temporarily cooperating. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a maritime passage, it is a fire alarm wired into the global economy, pulled whenever perception of risk crosses invisible thresholds. And right now, the alarm is not ringing fully, it is flickering. That flicker is the most dangerous state of all, because it does not demand action. It delays it until action becomes unavoidable. So the core thesis is simple. This is not a war that is about to begin. This is a system already behaving as if war is an acceptable outcome in its calculation space. And once a system starts calculating that way, reversing it becomes harder than continuing it. So I return to the question that defines everything here. Can a region built on strategic dependency, mutual deterrence, and economic interconnection ever fully return to normal stability after it begins rehearsing its own instability? Or is that idea of normality already something we are remembering instead of living? Share this with someone who still thinks the US-Iran situation is just another routine cycle of Gulf tension. It is not. It is a case study in how modern power systems manage escalation without calling it war, until the cost of denial becomes higher than the cost of acknowledgement. Now I want you to think in 3 directions. Question 1, analytical. If maritime security in the Gulf is already operating under continuous high alert rotation, what single misread signal, naval, drone, or cyber, would be enough to trigger irreversible escalation sequencing between US and Iranian forces? Question 2, accountability. If all actors involved are publicly committed to stability, but operational behavior keeps moving toward higher readiness, who actually carries responsibility for preventing the moment when coordination fails? Political leadership, military command structures, or the intelligence systems interpreting the signals? Question 3, universal. Is global stability ever truly stable, or is it always just a temporary agreement between systems that are constantly preparing for the moment that agreement breaks? If this analysis matters to you, subscribe and turn on notifications, because what happens next in this story will not unfold in headlines that wait for you to catch up. Like this video if you want more breakdowns that go beyond surface reporting, and share it with someone who follows geopolitics but still thinks in isolated events. instead of connected systems. I read every comment, especially from those who challenge the interpretation. This channel exists to cover the stories that are real, that have stakes, and that require more than a 90-second explanation to understand. Stay sharp.